This company had its own army, its own navy, the legal right to declare war, sign treaties, and execute people. It wasn't a country. At its peak, it has been estimated at somewhere between $7.5 and $10 trillion in today's money. Apple, the most valuable company on Earth right now, is worth about $3 trillion. This company was nearly 3 times that in the 1600s. It was called the Dutch East India Company, and almost nobody today knows it existed. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell this story. The company didn't fall from the outside. It was being hollowed out from within, slowly for decades, by the very men trusted to run it. By the time the killing blow came, there was almost nothing left to kill. By the end of this video, you'll never look at a stock market, a corporate board, or a company you think is untouchable the same way again. To understand what the Dutch East India Company became, you have to understand the world it was born into. It's the late 1500s. Europe is obsessed with spices, not in the way we think about seasoning food today. In the 16th century, pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were worth more than gold by weight. They preserved meat through long winters, masked the smell of decay, and signaled wealth in a way nothing else could. A merchant who controlled the spice trade didn't just have money, he had power. The spices came from the Maluku Islands, a tiny volcanic archipelago in what is now eastern Indonesia, roughly 8,000 miles from Europe. Getting there meant sailing around Africa, crossing the Indian Ocean, and navigating waters that nobody in Europe had charted properly. The Portuguese had figured out the route first and held a near monopoly on the trade for most of the 1500s. The Dutch wanted in, and they were tearing themselves apart trying. Before the VOC existed, Dutch merchants were already attempting the journey to Asia, but in competing fleets, spending fortunes, undercutting each other's prices, racing to the same ports. It was commercial chaos. The competition that was supposed to make them strong was making them weak. What they needed wasn't more ships. It was one man willing to force everyone into the same room. In 1602, that man was Johann van Oldenbarnevelt. And what he built in that room would change the world. He wasn't an explorer. He wasn't a sailor. He was a politician. And the company he was about to create wouldn't just dominate global trade. It would invent the very system that all of global trade still runs on today. But first, it almost died before it started. On March 20th, 1602, Van Oldenbarnevelt forced every Dutch company trading with Asia to merge into one. Not a partnership, not an alliance. One company with one charter, granted by the Dutch government, with legal powers no private business had ever been given before. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. The first challenge nearly ended everything. Earlier Dutch expeditions to Asia had been brutal. The very first fleet, which left in 1595, lost 2/3 of its crew to scurvy, storms, and violence. Of the 249 men who set sail, only 87 returned. They brought back enough spices to turn a small profit, barely. A lesser organization would have quit. The VOC didn't quit. It did something nobody had ever done before. To fund its first major fleet, the VOC sold shares to the public, not to wealthy merchants behind closed doors. To anyone. Craftsmen, sailors, ordinary citizens of Amsterdam could buy a stake in the company and share in the profits. In 1602, the VOC launched the world's first initial public offering, and in doing so, it helped establish and standardize the modern shareholder model. Tradable shares, a permanent joint stock structure, a professional board of directors, all built for this one company to fund one fleet to go get spices. Every stock you've ever owned, every publicly traded company that exists today, every stock exchange on Earth, all of it traces back to this moment. A Dutch spice trader trying to fund a boat. The public responded. The VOC raised 6.4 million guilders in its first subscription, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. The money flowed, the ships sailed. Picture Amsterdam's docks in those first years. Barrels, ledgers, crowds, and a single monogram stamped on everything. VOC. 3 letters that would come to mean more than any flag. Then came the man who changed everything. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen was appointed Governor General of VOC operations in Asia in 1618. Where other leaders negotiated, Cohen conquered. He established a permanent headquarters at Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, fortified it, garrisoned it with soldiers, and made it unambiguously clear. Any local ruler who refused to deal exclusively with the VOC would face military consequences. Here's the part that rarely gets mentioned. Cohen wrote letters back to Amsterdam arguing that trade without the ability to wage war was impossible. The VOC's board agreed. They didn't just tolerate the violence, they sanctioned it. The army, the warships, the forts. These weren't a side effect of the business. They were the business model. Within 30 years of its founding, the VOC had established trading posts across Japan, India, Persia, Ceylon, and the Indonesian archipelago. By 1670, it employed 50,000 people, operated 150 merchant ships, and maintained a private army of 40,000 soldiers. The numbers are staggering. But numbers don't capture what the VOC actually was at its height. To understand that, you have to understand what it was legally allowed to do, and who paid the price for it. At its height, the VOC wasn't just the most valuable company in history. It was the most powerful organization on Earth that wasn't a government. And depending on how you define government, it might have been that too. Let's put the scale in context. The VOC employed 70,000 people at its peak, more than the entire population of many European cities at the time. Its merchant fleet carried more cargo annually than the combined fleets of England and France, not comparable to them, more than both of them together. And then there are the powers, and the way it held that monopoly wasn't paperwork, it was force. The VOC's charter, granted by the Dutch government, gave it capabilities that today belong exclusively to sovereign nations. It could declare war on foreign powers and negotiate binding peace treaties. It could administer justice, including the power of imprisonment and execution. It could build and garrison military fortifications. It could mint its own currency. In the territories it controlled, the VOC wasn't operating within a government's jurisdiction. It was the government. There was no line between corporate power and political power because in VOC territory they were the same thing. This is what too big to govern looks like at full power, an organization so vast, so profitable, and so geographically spread that it had effectively outgrown the oversight of any single authority, including its own board. At its absolute peak in the mid-1600s, the VOC's estimated value in today's money was around $8 trillion, the current GDP of the entire United States. Every good and service produced by the largest economy on Earth in a full year is $27 trillion. A single private company in the 1600s. With wooden ships and handwritten ledgers, worth nearly a third of modern America's entire annual output. If that just broke your brain a little, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Remember what I said at the start, that by the time the killing blow came, there was almost nothing left to kill. We're almost there. But first you need to understand what was actually happening behind those numbers. Because behind every profit figure was a human, cost the shareholders in Amsterdam rarely thought about. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, the man who built the VOC into a military empire, didn't negotiate with rulers who refused his terms. In 1621, Cohen ordered the massacre of the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. The indigenous Bandanese population of roughly 15,000 people was reduced to approximately 1,000 within weeks. Those who survived were enslaved to work the nutmeg plantations under VOC control. This was not an aberration. It was the business model. The VOC's wealth was built on monopoly enforced by violence, on trade routes controlled by military threat, and on labor extracted by coercion. Every guilder flowing back to Amsterdam was underwritten by someone, somewhere, who had no choice in the matter. And yet, even at this height, even with all of this power, the rot had already begun. They had more power than most governments, more money than most countries, and they were completely convinced it would last forever. They were wrong. And the way it fell apart is unlike anything you've heard before. Here's the truth about how the VOC died. The VOC didn't collapse. It was siphoned. It wasn't the wars. It wasn't the competition. Those were the final blows. But the body was already failing long before anyone landed a punch. For decades, VOC agents across Asia had been running private businesses on the side, skimming cargo, taking bribes from local merchants who wanted favorable treatment, building personal fortunes while filing reports that bore little resemblance to reality. The distances involved made meaningful oversight almost impossible. A letter from Batavia to Amsterdam took months. By the time any order was issued and a response received, circumstances had changed completely. The VOC's board passed regulation after regulation. They issued codes of conduct, demanded sworn oaths, threatened dismissal and punishment. None of it worked because the corruption wasn't a few bad actors making individual choices. It had become the culture, the expected behavior, the system that everyone inside it understood and participated in. And here's what makes this more than a historical footnote. It's the inevitable endpoint of any organization that gets too big to govern. The VOC had conquered half of Asia, but couldn't solve the basic problem of distance and accountability. When the rewards are enormous and the oversight is weak, people take what they can. Not because VOC agents were uniquely corrupt, because power without accountability always ends the same way. By the 1770s, the VOC was carrying debts it couldn't service. Decades of skimmed profits and inflated costs had eaten the foundation. And then the war came. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War began in 1780. Britain, recognizing the VOC as a strategic rival, systematically targeted its shipping lanes. VOC vessels were captured or destroyed. Trade routes the company had controlled for over a century were severed. The cargo stopped flowing. The revenue collapsed. Here's the detail that hits hardest. A financially healthy VOC, one that hadn't been gutted from within, might have survived. It had survived near extinction before. The First Fleet lost 2/3 of its crew, and the company kept going. But this VOC was already hollow. The war didn't destroy it. The war just made the hollowness visible. By the 1780s, VOC sailors were going months without pay. Ships sat rotting in harbors because there was no money for repairs. Men who had signed up to serve the most powerful company on Earth found themselves stranded in foreign ports, broke, abandoned, waiting for orders that never came from a company that had already ceased to function long before it ceased to exist. The cascade accelerated. Debt mounted. Trading posts were abandoned. Shareholders stopped receiving dividends. The Dutch government nationalized what remained. On December 31st, 1799, the charter of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie expired. It was not renewed. After 197 years, the most powerful company in human history was gone. But here's the thing about the VOC's collapse. It didn't just destroy a company. It changed the shape of the world, and some of what it left behind is sitting in your pocket right now. When the VOC dissolved, it left behind debts of 140 million guilders, one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in history at the time. It also left behind Indonesia. 2 centuries of VOC control had fundamentally shaped the archipelago, its trade patterns, its infrastructure, its regional divisions. Indonesia would remain a Dutch colony for another 150 years after the VOC's collapse. The company was gone. The consequences weren't. But the VOC's most enduring legacy isn't found in Indonesia. It's in the financial architecture of the modern world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first, was created specifically to trade VOC shares. It still operates today. The shareholder, the board of directors, limited liability. All of it invented for one company in one city in 1602 to fund one fleet. When you buy a stock, open a brokerage account, or read about a company's quarterly earnings, you are participating in a system built by a Dutch spice trader who needed to fund a boat. The VOC didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it grew too big to govern, too geographically vast for real oversight, too profitable for its own agents to stay honest, too powerful for anyone to question until the questioning came too late. That pattern, unchecked scale, eroding accountability, internal rot dressed up as external strength, shows up in every era, in every industry. In organizations we look at today and consider permanent. What's the first modern company you think is already hollow inside? And why? Drop it in the comments. I reply to all of them. If you want to know what happened to the other empires that were supposed to last forever, subscribe. A new one drops every week.